If you clicked on this video, perhaps it's because you really love Pokemon games and you want to see if you can get some more insight into this one. It may also be because you absolutely hate Pokemon games and for some reason you won't give them up even though you literally haven't enjoyed one of the games in 15 years. Or perhaps it's because you've enjoyed my content so much that you were willing to jump over here from other corners of the internet to listen to my deep dives and explanations of things as we break down what's going on in the Pokemon universe. No matter which side you're on, unfortunately you get to deal with this garbage microphone because when I went to use my mic that I used for filming, it would not work properly, so here we are. Now, unlike a lot of other Pokemon content creators, I'm actually very excited with what I've seen for this game. I'm so excited for us to see more. I cannot wait to go back to Kalos. Kalos is my favorite region. It has been since I first played the games in 2013. So seeing a game with Lumiose City is just incredible. I cannot wait to see what else there is in store for us. But as far as this game goes, I have looked at this trailer, I've looked at this footage really extensively. Obviously, a lot of things remain unknown. We have about 5 minutes of footage. There's not a ton that we can gather from that, but I love to break down historical context of games and just critical thinking and critical analysis of these different games and the franchise as a whole. So that's what we're going to do in this unnecessarily long video today. A couple of unnecessary things I want to point out at the beginning of this video is we do know now that we would say this game as Pokemon Legends ZA. I was unsure because stylized it is a Z with a hyphen to an A, so I thought maybe Z2A, Z through A, but in the game trailers, they have said ZA, so that is what I'm going to use going forward, as well as AZ. I swear we don't have any official content anywhere where they actually say his name out loud, but now we do in this trailer. I want to start first talking about some things that we've now learned that I believe we can recognize as potential patterns for future Legends installments in this franchise. Last year when we were first told about this new Legends title, there were so many people very quick to assume all of these things that were going to be the case, and they were claiming things like precedent, despite the fact that we had one single Legends title. So now we're able to look at this game and see what we know a little bit more concrete. Now, this could always change because we've seen changes and deviations in the other series of mainline games. So it's not to say that we won't see changes in future Legends games, but I think this helps give us a little bit more of a framework going forward that I think is important to note. The first thing that we see, I would say, is the playable character itself. They do seem to be a little bit older. There's always this kind of joke about the age of the playable character in Pokemon games who I think have often been around 10 years, but we've seen 10, 12, 14. I think that now we have a second model of a Legends playable character. It seems to be a character that I would say is maybe 14, maybe a little bit older, but like preteen, teen age. So we're not dealing with that super young 10-year-old. We're dealing with more of maybe like a preteen or a teenager age player. And I think that's worth noting. The next element that seems to be consistent across the games is that in whatever way, the playable character is not native to the specific game. So when I break that down, what I mean is that when we look at PLA, that was a modern day child who lived in the Sinnoh region who was pulled to the past by Arceus. So that child was taken to a past version of Sinnoh, but they are not actually native to Hisui. They were removed from their main home and they were brought to the past. They were brought to Hisui. As it relates to this game, it's not 100% clear yet. So this could change maybe a little bit, but the playable character is on some type of trip or journey and they go to Lumiose City. So again, this child could be Kalosian. I don't want to erase that. However, they are not seemingly a kid who lives in Lumiose City. So when it comes to the other mainline series, we obviously have kids who move to their regions. We literally have that in Scarlet and Violet. Your playable character has just moved there, but you live there. You live in that region. You are establishing a life there. That's not always the case, but you do have an established life and your family is present in that region. So far with these, we haven't seen that being repeated. So that seems to be potentially an element. Whatever that might actually help entail in the future is a little unclear, but that does seem to be a reoccurring theme. The next point to, I think, my disappointment and many others is you do get a rival player, which is not a bad thing, but they do seem to consistently be making your rival the opposite gender of your playable character. So if you choose the male character, you will have a female rival. If you choose the female character, you will have a male rival. We've seen iterations of that in the other mainline series, but that does seem to be something that they're going to keep doing or they have done now for 2 games. But I actually want to point out another thing with the rivals that seems to be a deviation between these 2 games. In PLA, your rival does look like, I would say, the opposite of the playable character as it relates in the context of not only Hisui, but also Sinnoh. Like that does look like an aged up playable character from the original Sinnoh games. But here in Lumio City, your playable character, I've seen some people discussing some theories about who they think these playable characters might be or might be inspired by. But at the same time, your rival, they don't seem to look like, Tierno or Shauna or any of the other characters that we encountered or that were our rivals in the original Kalos series. They don't look like Serena. They don't look like Callum. So it's just a very interesting thought because Urbane and Tawny don't seem, from my perspective, to really look like another character. Although I have seen it pointed out, and I'm curious if this will come back out, they both are kind of giving this Hisuian Zoroark vibe. Maybe that'll come up in the game. Who knows? But they seem to be different than we had in the PLA format. So we'll see how that perpetuates in future Legends titles. The next feature that does seem to be something that is now repeated in Legends titles is the introduction of starter or first partner Pokemon that are not native to the region in which we play. Obviously, of course, in PLA, we did not see the Sinnoh starters until later gameplay, and I'm optimistic that we'll see the Colossian starters be available to us later in the gameplay of this game, but we now have the introduction of 3 starters that are not originally native to this region being added to this game. The other thing to note here as well is that now we seem to have evidence that just because we are getting Pokemon that are not originally native or the first starter Pokemon in that region, it doesn't mean that it's going to be 3 different regions. We obviously very famously now have 2 Johtonian Pokemon here, so in future Legends titles, who knows if they'll bring an entire region over and place all 3 of their Pokemon in a new region, or if we'll continue to see maybe 2 starters from the same region pulled into another game as it's relevant. This is just an interesting little thing. There was no precedent. We just had 3 Pokemon that weren't originally native to Sinnoh or Hisui, and then they were there. Now we've got 3 Pokemon that are not native to Kalos that are here. Who knows what that'll mean? And I have more to say on the starters. We're going to get to that later. And the other point that I want to hit on that I haven't seen other people talking about, I've been pitching this since last year. I'm not saying I'm super revolutionary for figuring it out, but in PLA, the game did not move in the format of the traditional 8 gyms. And now granted, we've seen some variations and some deviation a little bit from that full structure in the other mainline series of games, but ultimately that's kind of the way that the gameplay moves forward in the other mainline series. In PLA, you had 5 regions that you moved through and they had different tasks. Each of them had a boss battle at the end, basically. So it's something of that regard, but we had 5 regions with a final climax point that we had in PLA. And if you are familiar with Lumio City, I have been saying this since last year. Lumio City has naturally been divided into 5 areas since the introduction of X and Y. In Lumio City, we also have these 5 quintets, also known as plazas. And we can see them here on this promotional map for PLZA. We have 5 plazas that create the circumference of this city, and that is the Vert Plaza, the Blue Plaza, the Magenta Plaza, the Rouge Plaza, and the Jaune Plaza. And then, of course, in the center, we have the Centrico Plaza. So again, this is not fully confirmed, but just observationally trying to look for patterns that make sense in gameplay format. We had 5 regions and a final place in PLA being the Temple of Sinnoh, that final, climactic place. And here in Lumio City, I am going to predict and assume that we are going to move through each of the plazas, and then ultimately whatever final moments we have is going to take place probably in the Prism Tower, on top of the Prism Tower, something in the Centrico Plaza, and we'll probably pass through them. Maybe we'll move in a clock-like fashion around the city. I don't know. It does seem like from some of the promotional photos that we've seen that we will be able to access the Prism Tower in some capacity, or we'll be able to pass through. And again, maybe we'll be able to walk through, maybe we won't be able to go inside right away. But I do think that is the pattern formula that we are now seeing in Legends games, is that it is 5 areas that we have to move through in order to tell the entire story of the game. And am I kind of beating this dead horse about the patterns because so many people would not let me rest when I said I don't think this game is going to take place in the past? As a reminder, the playable character in PLA gets pulled to the past. They're a modern day kid. And so maybe I'm beating a dead horse because I get it. Like, we saw a game that was unprecedented where they took a player and brought them to the past, but there's no reason that that would be the assumption that that happens in every game. I say as the Pokemon archaeologist that would be happy if every single game took place in the past. I would love to experience the Great Kalos War in real time. I just am mindful and observational of how these games seem to move. And again, just because the game does not take place in the past does not mean that we will not learn history. I'm very confident that we likely will. Speaking of history, let's have a little discussion on urban redevelopment as a whole, as it may relate to this game, to Pokemon as a whole, and everything in between. Because, of course, on Pokemon Day in 2024, we got this little teaser, which just give us these little drawings and renderings at the very beginning, and then quickly turns into this modern digital looking blueprint practice that we see across this little teaser. And so, as a reminder, when we were first given this trailer in 2024, the only thing we were given was this short sentence that says, "A new adventure awaits within Lumio City, where an urban redevelopment plan is underway to shape the city into a place that belongs to both people and Pokemon." And so again, we have this digital rendering that was put up. It shows people that look pretty modern. Again, it's not that people don't have some of these things in the past, but we see like someone with a backpack on, and we just kind of see what looks like modern clothing silhouettes and everything in between. So there was a lot of discussion about what this could be. And again, people were really hung up on, though, this is definitely going to be 19th century Paris. I'm also going to point out that this trailer still makes me very emotional. Kalos is my favorite region, as I think I've already said. It's my absolute favorite. When Lumio City was revealed, I was elated. I literally probably cried. It was so special to me. So let's get into that a little bit more. So like I said, again, we didn't know what to expect when we first saw this teaser. Nobody was really expecting it maybe, but when we got it, there was this instant discussion of, oh, this is going to be another game looking into the past of Pokemon. So we're obviously going to go back to 19th century Paris for the essentially infamous Haussmann urban redevelopment that occurred between 1853 and 1870. And I thought, oh, what an interesting idea. But as I sat and I watched that trailer countless times, I became less and less convinced. One, because again, we only had one single game that took a modern day character to the past. And again, it's not that time travel doesn't exist in the Pokemon universe, because it does, but a game that is set so heavily in that context, where a Pokemon, being Arceus, very specifically took the child and brought them to Hisui. I was like, I don't think that's going to happen. Like, Arceus isn't probably going to be around here. I saw people claiming that Zygarde was going to take you to the past. And I was like, I think we need to remember that different legendary Pokemon have different roles and abilities and all of that in between. But so anyways, Haussmann's urban redevelopment of Paris, which was commissioned under Napoleon III, was again between 1853 and 1870 in Paris. Now, the thing about this urban redevelopment and all urban redevelopment as a whole is it is continually recognized as very controversial and argued by many to be very harmful, specifically because it results often in things like gentrification and slum clearance, where it is removing poor people and dirty people and any other terms you think people will associate with different classes of people. That is what a lot of this is. And Haussmann's urban redevelopment was also heavily criticized and is still heavily criticized to this day. That urban redevelopment plan as a whole was responsible for things like demolition of tons of different neighborhoods, widening the avenues that you had in Paris. It did also add many new parks, which we'll come back to. It also included things like new construction of sewers, fountains, and other water features, and it was completed across 3 phases. And these 3 phases of construction did see a mix of both traditional and innovative architecture, because a lot of things that were being torn down were like medieval architecture, but they were still leaning back into the traditional architecture, which I will admit, in the shots that we've seen in this game, you can definitely tell that there is evidence of traditional architecture still remaining in Lumio City. And don't get me wrong, it could be that this urban redevelopment plan that we see that's going to take place in this new Legends game may in part mirror Haussmann's urban redevelopment plan. That is not a crazy thought to think. People were just using it as, oh, that took place in the 19th century, so this also has to take place in the past of Pokemon. That's not necessarily true. We have Pokemon that are very present in our understanding of ancient history, and yet they're modern Pokemon. So it's not all one side or the other. So like I was saying, Haussmann's plans were widely criticized and in many instances condemned by wide varieties of critics. The redevelopment led to a great deal of social disruption. So families and businesses were having to vacate because buildings were being torn down, places where they lived, places where they worked. And another important thing to note that is pretty well documented is that they saw rental prices for housing in Paris at that time skyrocket as much as 300%. And of course, wages did not keep up with that. So people were finding that they were no longer able to stay where they had lived for generations because of these changes. I do want to be fair because there are some studies that suggest that actually the number of people, specifically like lower income people that were in Paris at that time that were being priced out essentially, that vacated or or went to further out boroughs, that is not actually an accurate reflection of what we now know today. So again, it's just very widely criticized. Some are still in high support of it. There are many people who believe that we would not have the Paris of today if not for all the work of Haussmann during that time. And there are many that continually talk about its harms and all of the problems that it caused. Now, I do believe that we're going to see the harmful practices of urban redevelopment in this game for a multitude of reasons, because are you telling me that Jet and Vinny do not look like sinister characters? Like, let's be for real in that regard. I think the potential of these characters and Quasartico Inc. being the bad guys in this game will be about as shocking as when we found out that Chairman Rose was a bad guy in Sword and Shield. I think it's pretty obvious that they're going to be connecting that in some way. Maybe they won't. Maybe we'll be completely wrong. But we see a lot of corporations ultimately have nefarious intentions in the Pokemon universe, and we see them be bad guys. And again, you're telling me that these characters don't look like bad guys? And the name of this company is literally Quasartico Incorporated. And say what you want, but sometimes they make things a little over in this game. And I am not an astronomy expert, so I don't want to fully misspeak. You can look into what a quasar is, but it's basically, in my understanding, they're found in the center of different galaxies and are some of the most powerful objects literally in the universe, and are basically powered by a supermassive, like an extra large black hole. So if we're naming a company after something that can destroy universes and emit extensive power, I'm going to assume that this is probably not a good company. Maybe I'm crazy for that. Maybe I'm completely off my rocker for that, but I think that's a really intentional naming of a company, and I think it's a good indication of what we might see. But that would help support this concept of understanding that maybe urban redevelopment is actually often done harmfully and not ethically. My thought originally was maybe we'll see this ethical portrayal of urban redevelopment, but that seems to be quickly being debunked by a couple of things. Already very famously, the bench that we've seen in the trailer, that is an indication of hostile architecture, which is this concept where architecture is crafted so that specifically like unhoused people are unable to use it in any capacity, like to sleep on a bench or something of that regard. Whether it is an intentional ad or not, it's still a normalization of the practice, and I find it very relevant to point it out in a game where we were told from the get-go that an urban redevelopment project is ongoing in this city. So whether you think that Pokemon was lazily adding it in, which I disagree with, or it was added intentionally, it shows that that is a practice that is being used, and whether it's been normalized or it's an intentional ad, because again, you know, a lot of people are pointing this out and I agree wholeheartedly. You see this example of hostile architecture. Yes, people would not be able to use it, like an unhoused person would not be able to sleep on it, but also like a larger Pokemon would not be able to sit on it. Pokemon, if they are truly interacting with people, they come in all shapes and sizes. So doing something like this is harmful in a lot of ways, and it's also harming Pokemon. Let's talk about the timeline of where we should be putting this game, although I don't think we're fully going to know until we actually get more context, and probably actually not until the game's release and we get to see actual dialogue and piece these things together. Again, there's this big discourse. It's in the past, and so people were saying as well, oh, well, if it's not in the past, that's because it's way out in the future, because past and future. And listen, again, friends, I understand as someone who looks for pattern recognition, but it's okay for two things to not always have to click. There can be things that are different, and some people I think are really struggling with that. But even so, this is officially on the Pokemon Center's website, and it just says the story is set in Lumio City, where an urban redevelopment plan is underway to shape the city into a place that belongs to both Pokemon and people. Compared to Lumio City as it appeared in Pokemon X and Pokemon Y, released in 2013, more greenery now adorns the city alongside facilities with a cutting-edge feel. It is true that you could interpret that different ways, and I understand if someone wants to interpret it a different way, but I'm interpreting that as a sequential proceeding. In X and Y, this is how the city used to look. Now, today, we see some changes. We see some advancement. And so that's what I think the intent is here. Again, is it maybe a time jump of 10, 12, 15, 20 years? Probably. I don't think that's a crazy thing to think, but this mindset, oh, it's super futuristic. This is a super future game because we had a super past game, so we have to have a super future game. I think that's just, again, forcing something that doesn't need to be there. It's just a game that takes place in what we would consider modern day. Like, this game probably exists, and the timeline of this event probably exists around the same time as what the playable character was experiencing in Scarlet and Violet. I did post a TikTok kind of going into this a little bit, and there was someone in the comments that just would not let go, and they kept saying, yes, it's the future because it's the future of X and Y. And we're like, well, yes, but that's like saying for me today, I live in the future because the present day is the future of what was 2013. I mean, that's true. It is true. This is the future from 12 years ago, but it is considered the present day because it is right now. So it's just a silly little argument. It's really not that serious. But again, maybe there'll be a time jump. There's been some discussion from folks, again, about the playable character looking like maybe Sycamore or our mom. So maybe we've seen a little bit of a gap there. And I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it'll really matter in the way that history mattered in Hisui. I don't think it really matters. I think this game takes place sometime after the events of X and Y. I think recognizing that this game has to take place after the events of X and Y is also reinforced by AZ's presence as a whole. If you are familiar with the story of AZ, he was the king of Kalos, to the best of our understanding, 3,000 years prior to the events of X and Y. There was a great war that broke out. His Floette was brought in to fight in the war against his will, and his Floette did not survive the war. He built the ultimate weapon. He was trying to revive Floette. He wanted to end the war. Floette was brought back to life, but when his Floette saw what he had done to end the war, it was ashamed of him and it left him. And so he has traveled and wandered Kalos and the world for these 3,000 years. And basically, once he was able to find peace and self-reflection and really forgive himself and all of that, that's when his Floette returned to him. We see that documented in the game as well as in one of the little animes that we have. And so Floette returned to him. So we are seeing him and his partner Floette, identified as his partner, both seemingly, I would say, very happy. He looks healed. He looks refreshed. He looks like he's had the chance to relax and enjoy himself with his Floette. They seem happy and content, and so they are together here. So he has now settled into this role as owning Hotel Z. So he is the owner and presumably maybe operator of this hotel, but they are happy and they are here. So it seems that would mean that this is at least a few years. I mean, it could be a couple of days, a little bit of time after X and Y, because AZ and Floette have reunited. Now it's time to really get into a closer look at these starters. Now, I love to see these starters. I think this threw everyone for a loop and I love it. Obviously, my flower baby and I stay winning, but there are a couple of questions I know everybody are asking. The first one is, will these Pokemon get regional forms, presumably in their final evolutionary stage? And if they do, or even if they don't, will they get mega forms? People have already caught the glimpse of Chikorita where she's in battle and you're able to see that she has a fairy type move she has previously not had access to before. So this is asking the question, is there a fairy type in the future for her, whether in a mega form or in an alternative form? Maybe, possibly, probably. We obviously don't know. I don't think that's a crazy stretch, but I think we're just not gonna know until we see that final form. And I've already seen people latching onto concepts they think are French and relevant, and I don't think that's a crazy idea. So people have already locked in and said they're confident that the final form of Feraligatr is going to be water poison. Maybe that's true. I don't know. We'll see what results in those things, but I want to ask the question, why these three starters? This is something that I think a lot of people are asking, and the reality is that we don't know. We don't know, at least not yet. But there is, of course, the follow-up glaring question, why two Johtonian starters? I'm kind of hoping that it's a simple concept that whoever gives us access to our first partner Pokemon, like maybe they went to Johto, maybe they mention that and they say, oh, I got these two Pokemon while I was there, and then, oh, I need a third. Like maybe there'll be some cute little story set up, but I don't know if we'll see that. But the confusing part to me is trying to understand the connection, if there is a relevance, to two Johtonian Pokemon here in Kalos. As it relates to PLA, the story was that Laventon had traveled around the world and he had kind of picked up these Pokemon from all over the world in his travel time. And so that kind of gave us an answer as to why those three Pokemon, and they were just from a lot of different places. But when it relates to these, we don't have any connection yet that would tie Kalos really strongly to Johto the way we could tie regions together that we've been able to tie together for other games. Some notable examples would be obviously kind of the infamous Johto-Sinnoh connection with Sinjoh, which may be Celestica people connected, I don't know, but we have others, even like Kanto and Johto being neighbors to each other. There was some discussion when we got the DLC for Scarlet and Violet. Kitakami, a lot of people feel like maybe like a neighboring community to Johto based on the Pokemon that are present in that region. We obviously don't know, but there's these things that can be kind of connected. There are also some dialogue references from different NPCs in different games talking about being able to swim between two regions. But at this point, I really feel like Kalos and Johto are very disconnected region. We obviously have some Pokemon first discovered in Johto that are also native to the Kalos region, but I think Unova feels like a little bit of an easier connection, like New York to France. Again, I don't really like to use their official locations because these are individual entities, as the Pokemon Company has said. Yes, they take heavy inspiration from regions, but just kind of thinking in that concept and that kind of frame of mind. So, like bringing something from New York to France is kind of just like Western international relations. Doesn't really feel that crazy. But I think this is leading the way personally to regional forms for these Pokemon when it's all said and done. Because the concept of a regional variant or form is that a Pokemon who develops any kind of regional form has uniquely adapted to habitats that are different than those where the species is naturally lives in other parts of the world. So to me, seeing two Jotonian Pokemon here, if we're kind of comparing it to a real world, makes a lot of sense to me because the first four regions we were introduced to, being Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh, are most often recognized and known to be based off of Japanese regions and environments. So dropping a creature native to Japan in a European country really to me is paving that path very clearly for that unique adaptation to occur in a habitat it's not familiar with. Especially if you're going from these potential like lush areas with open green spaces to like a concrete jungle of sorts, I think this is creating a perfect intersection for why these Pokemon will probably have regional variants. So when I think of it through that lens, seeing multiple Jotonian Pokemon here doesn't feel that crazy to me because again, if you're looking at the environment and the ecosystems of Japan, they're going to be very different from those of France, and in the same sense, Johto and Kalos. So you're seeing this really strong contrast, which is again paving the way for these Pokemon to have alternate variations in their evolutionary patterns. Versus if you were to just drop a bunch of Galarian Pokemon into Kalos, those environments are probably quite comparable. Sure, there's definitely going to be differences. Obviously, there are things that are native to these places that are not native to the others, but they're so similar, the Pokemon is not going to need to adapt in its evolution. Versus with these really stark contrasts, it gives more room for this opportunity. And I will again say that the jump from Unova to Kalos doesn't seem super severe, but obviously there are going to be different climates, environments, and more. So we'll have to see if that does in fact create that perfect storm for this divergence in evolution. But I really think that's a really key element that I think a lot of people maybe are more stressed about as opposed to recognizing that this was actually very overtly intentional. And listen, I appreciate the jokes of like, oh, we forgot to turn in our homework last minute. Let's just throw 3 starters in here. But to me, I think it's giving evidence of actual pathways for that divergence in evolution. So my same thought process is here with megas as a whole. I think a lot of people are expecting new megas. I'm not at all surprised we didn't see any yet. I'm sure we will get some in future trailers. I'm actually very confident in that without evidence, but I believe we'll see those over the coming months. And I think it would be incredibly awesome to see these Pokemon get megas, but I'm mainly confused about the outcome because what would happen if these Pokemon have Kalosian form? So again, let's think about this. A Pokemon that's native to Johto is then dropped into Kalos, and as it evolves, it adapts, and this new evolution makes its way forward. So if we have, let's say now, a Kalosian Meganium, is it only Kalosian Meganium that can now mega evolve? To me, it kind of suggests that we're only going to get one of those two options, and it makes more sense scientifically to me that we'll see regional variants, again, adapting to this new environment and creating a new evolution. But if we tied megas to it, again, that would be so confusing. Can you imagine having a Feraligatr, but let's say you have a Jotonian Feraligatr, so it can't mega evolve, but a Kalosian Feraligatr can mega evolve? I feel like that's really complicated. Maybe I'm totally missing the mark on that. And that might also be the case why we don't see things like the Hoenn starters here. A lot of people upset that we didn't see some of the Hoenn Pokemon show up here, but they have mega evolutions. So would that complicate things? So if we now have, let's say, Torchic as a starter and it gets a Kalosian evolution, because again, the Hoenn Pokemon are in a more Japanese environment, so we would probably see that forced need for an adaptation in their evolution. Would that mean that Kalosian Blaziken can mega evolve, or would it not be able to mega evolve? So these make sense to me. I think that maybe what we could see, again, I don't know. This is just a theory. I always love to pitch theories, and I want people to know that the best thing about theories is that when we get more evidence, we can reassess and adjust as we need to. That's just kind of my thought process here. If we're thinking about it from a more like scientific and like evolutionary standpoint, this is the path that I see forward, but maybe I'm totally wrong, and that's okay. But if you want to have a little bit of peace and feel like there's actually maybe a reason for all of this, maybe it is a very, very overtly intentional option, maybe this is why. All right, let's learn our A through Z's as it relates to AZ. So this is the man from Kalos who is believed to be, and I think accepted by most players, as the king of the Kalos region approximately 3,000 years prior to the events of X and Y, and he is most known for being the creator, believed to be responsible for the creation of the ultimate weapon. And what led him to creating this device is in relation to his beloved Floette, which is a very unique looking Floette. As of recording this video, we, the players, have never been able to have or possess a Floette that looks like this one with the same flower and color pattern. But so this great war that occurred took the lives of many, many Pokemon, and his Floette was forced to go into the war as well, and she unfortunately did not survive the war. And AZ himself was overcome with such grief, he was looking for a way to bring her back to life, and in the process he created the ultimate weapon, and even though it was successful, he still could not overcome his grief, and he turned the weapon onto the war, and he used it in order to effectively end the war. And it was with great tragedy, great loss, that he ended the war during that time. However, once his Floette found what he had done, she abandoned him and left him, and he was basically left to wander the entire world. This story in part seems to be based off of the Gilgamesh epic, which is one of the oldest documented pieces of mythology and literature that we have to this day. It's an ancient Sumerian story about the story of a great king named Gilgamesh, and some of the ways that we see this mirrored is that Gilgamesh was recognized as an incredibly tall individual. AZ himself appears to be over 9 feet in height, but another comparison is that Gilgamesh has a friend named Enkidu who passes away tragically in the story as well, and it sets Gilgamesh out to see if he can find a way to achieve eternal life in his grief. Enkidu has a different role completely than Floette does, but it's just kind of that same parallel that we see. So as it relates to AZ in this story, we have to believe, as I've said before, I think it's very strong and reasonable to believe that this game occurs after the events of X and Y. And quite famously, after the events of X and Y, we do see Floette return to AZ and they are reunited, seemingly indicated that he is healed and he has been able to let go of the grief that he's been overcome with, and Floette does return to him. So now we're here, we're in Lumio City, presumably in some point after those events. AZ has settled into owning and running Hotel Z as we seem to know it, with Floette, who is always by his side, and they run this hotel. But I want to point out that I think AZ is looking good. You can tell in X and Y, I think personally, that the man is carrying this grief that he's had with him. He's carrying his burdens physically and metaphorically, and he seems to have released them. Obviously, he's not sojourning around Kalos or around the world, and he has settled into Hotel Z, but he does seem like he's quite content, like he's happy and at peace with himself. Obviously, Floette is with him, and so he's able to run Hotel Z, and he seems to welcome you pretty politely, and he looks really great. I also, of course, love the nods here in his design where they have his, because he is so tall, he has clothing that he's extended the length of so that it actually covers his arms, so that it actually covers his legs. I think that's a fun little touch, and so we're able to see him in this role. But the thing with AZ that I think is important to note is that he is coming to this game and to this world. We don't know what his full role will be. I will hope that by adding him to the game, he will be some sort of communicator. We haven't seen a professor yet, to my knowledge, so I'm wondering if he will hold a place comparable to that, like maybe he's who we'll report to, or who will be giving us information and insight. Because I think it's important to note that AZ has seen Kalos for the last 3,000 years. He was the king of Kalos, and he saw all of the destruction, but also all of the reconstruction. So he has seen the entirety of Kalos. So I think if anybody is going to oppose this urban redevelopment, it's going to be him. And maybe he won't be so overt. Maybe he's kind of, ushering you to take the lead, and he's trying to, he doesn't trust himself maybe because of how he handled things 3,000 years ago. But this man knows everything about Kalos. He knows the history of Kalos. He's watched it all. So he is definitely here in some capacity. I'm hoping to be some kind of anchor for us. Don't know fully what yet, but I think it's important to recognize that. And I think, in a lot of ways, even though we saw technically his redemption arc, this will be maybe his redemption tour after the fact. And if he's here, there's a lot of discussion about the logo when we look at the Legend ZA logo. Obviously, I think a lot of people feel that the Z is pointing to Zygarde, which we can dissect a little bit more later. But we have this A. I've seen some people saying they feel like it kind of represents that visual structure of the ultimate weapon. Who's to say that Quasartico isn't trying to tap into that technology again? It's not like we haven't seen that before in this region, but maybe we're going to see him have to fully come out can express something and speak in condemnation of actions that he knows have failed this region before. I think it's also important to note, obviously we have seen AZ's Floette. He has had other Pokemon in past games and in the anime in these different contexts. So he most notably has usually like a Golurk as well as a Sigilyph. Both of those are in my background here. And those are Pokemon that are tied to ancient history and historical understanding, archaeology, all those things, as well as a Torkoal, which is usually indication, those animals as well as these Pokemon may live hundreds of years. Obviously, I've been talking a lot about Terapagos in my different content, Terapagos being what seems to be imagery of a world turtle. So lots of this imagery of Pokemon that seem to express longevity of life, ancient civilizations, history, the past. So that is a really strong tie here when we want to say, oh, there's connections of the past. We already have it with AZ in this game. I'm confident in that. So maybe those Pokemon will make an appearance. Maybe he will have to battle someone. And if he does, I would anticipate that we would see probably those Pokemon return. I do think a lot of people want to know if Eternal Flower Float would be catchable. I don't really see why it would be. That is AZ's partner Pokemon. Maybe if we were never returning to Kalos, they would do some sort of event where you could catch it. But he's been reunited with her. His entire life's mission became about bringing her back to life and reuniting with her. So I don't know. Maybe they'll do some kind of special event later where it's catchable. I'm sure it won't be catchable in this event because she'll be more like actually an NPC that you interact with in this game. But maybe there will be an opportunity to catch her in the future. I don't know. I think she belongs to AZ, and I'm okay with that. As it relates to things like this urban redevelopment, I want to get into discussing Pokemon and their adjacency to these wild areas in Lumio City that they're talking about. Part of this whole concept of this urban redevelopment is supposed to be focusing on making Lumio City a better city for both people and Pokemon. So it seems that the way that they're trying to do this is through these wild areas. They do feel very akin to like the wild zone or wild area in the Sword and Shield games and other games where we've kind of had these designated spaces for this, but they're creating these individual places. I did see some people getting frustrated by this, and I do really think like at its core, it's just like parks. Parks exist. Again, we talked about this. Houseman actually added 20 plus parks to Paris in that urban redevelopment process in the 19th century. So looking at the map, I think we can see that there's going to be at least one in every plaza. So that makes a lot of sense to me that we would see that be the main area for that. I also think, of course, from just a simple gameplay concept, we had to have areas where you could catch Pokemon, because if we're staying in this urban area, there's not going to be typically wild Pokemon, maybe like some birds or something just flying around casually, but the diverse range of Pokemon that you would hope to encounter, you're not going to be able to do casually in the city. But here's where my criticism comes in, because again, talking about this urban redevelopment concept, I don't understand how segregating Pokemon is really the solution, but I want to say from the other side that I get it, because it's kind of like, Pokemon and human do exist in a symbiotic kind of environment and relationship, like they exist alongside each other, but also Pokemon, if we're really trying to properly give them what they need, they do need a space to live independently. And so what is interesting to me is that they're creating these wild areas and they're having to bring in wild Pokemon. Like it feels like a zoo in a sense, there's the belief that like Pokemon that don't want to be caught won't be caught. So it's not so much about getting into that and, the ethics of, should trainers have Pokemon? I mean, I think that's a whole other discussion. But as it relates to this, they would have had to, I think, import these Pokemon. I don't think these Pokemon were naturally inhabiting these areas. So that's what's confusing to me. This feels like a way to segregate Pokemon, not in a way that allows them to thrive, but in a way that traps them. And that's where I'm a little confused. And again, that's where I have questions about this concept, where it feels like it may be actually a system that is here to actually harm Pokemon and possibly people. I don't know. Again, obviously from a gameplay perspective, and if we're staying inside of Lumio City, we have to have a place where you can literally catch Pokemon. That makes perfect sense. I understand that from a gameplay perspective, but I'm just thinking about this concept as it relates to the actual nature of Pokemon, what it means for them to exist, what it means for them to be in areas. Are we going to see these natural ecosystems that occur? Are they actually going to be meeting the needs of the Pokemon that are inside of them? I find that very interesting, and I think that's going to be the true indicator of what the attempt and what the intent of all these things is. I also do want to say, though, I don't think it's bad to create little biomes inside of a city so that Pokemon can roam more freely. I think that's a good thing. I really do. But I'm curious to see how this plays out and if this is going to prove to be a nefarious thing or if it's going to prove to be something that is actually beneficial for both humans and Pokemon. Because again, if they want wild Pokemon to roam through the city, then they're fencing them off. Are they fencing them off to keep people away, to give them freedom, or are they fencing them off to keep them away from people? That's where I think we're getting into this murky water, and that's what I want to dissect as we learn more about this game. I think that's really going to be that key indicator. So I was wrapping up recording and then I realized that I really didn't have anything that I'd said about Zygarde. And the reality is that I unfortunately don't have a lot to say about it. Obviously, we saw Zygarde in this trailer and I think that's important. And I think it's, again, pretty obvious that we have the logo and the Z is some kind of representation or indication of Zygarde's presence. And we saw the 10% form in the trailer. My mouth dropped. I mean, I thought we would see it, but I wasn't sure. I really wasn't sure. And we saw one of the Zygarde cells scooting around. So it seems like maybe we're going to be collecting those again for better or worse. I'm not sure how you want to consider that. But we do see that according to what the Pokemon Company has told us, that it seems to have taken a special interest in you. What can its connection to the story be? And the reality is that I really don't know. I really don't know. Obviously, Zygarde has some inspiration that I think is worth talking about. It's got some different connections to different like ancient deities and things like that. As a ground Pokemon, I love a good ground Pokemon, but I don't know if I know fully where this is going to fit into the story. I think, maybe as a protector of Kalos, we'll see it appear. And I think a lot of folks have said this, myself included, that in many ways, this game is the Pokemon Z that we never got in 2014 or 2015, whatever you'd like to put it. So wrapping up the story of Kalos by doing this, I think is going to be great. So I am not shocked in any way that it's really here. I am confident it'll have a part of the story that will be really important to us. I'm sure we'll be able to catch it. But as it relates to really kind of fully grasping what Zygarde's role is, I just don't think I have much to add right now. I think the big question that I have, and this is a discussion that has come up a few times, is if we see Zygarde, will we also be seeing Xerneas and Yveltal somewhere? I don't know. I would love to see them obviously in PLA. Arceus was a very focal point and we had interactions with Arceus, but we also did see Giratina as well as Dialga and Palkia, and we saw an entire history and lore connecting all those and past communities and people groups and how they worship them. So it really wouldn't surprise me to see them pop back out here. Again, maybe their role will be, I don't want to minimize Dialga and Palkia's presence in PLA, but I would say that the bigger, stronger presences of legendaries came from Arceus and Giratina. So I think we're having this. The only theory that I want to float, I don't have evidence to back it up. As we're looking at the logo again, we obviously have the Z that I do think is very indicative of Zygarde. We see the Zygarde patterning, the cells and everything like that, and the A. And I know I mentioned earlier that some think that maybe the A is actually connected to the ultimate weapon, but what if there's a new legendary? What if there is another Pokemon who is A in shape, since these Pokemon have very specific shapes? We have our Z right here. Maybe we'll see another legendary that has more to tell with the story. Because, the way that Zygarde's story was told was kind of funky, since it was supposed to, I think, for most of all of our understanding, really be in Kalos, and it kind of spilled over into Alola since we didn't get Pokemon Z. So maybe we'll see that kind of wrapped up and tied up more nicely, but maybe there's another legendary waiting for us. There were 4 legendaries in PLA, and I'm not saying that has to be the same, but maybe we will see all 3 of the ones we know about, and maybe there will be a 4th. I think that might be pretty interesting. I think that would be a little bit of a shock to a lot of folks. Always fun to see a new legendary Pokemon enter the fray. And I don't know how they're going to make an A shape if that's the case. Maybe it's not. Maybe it is. But that is just really my thoughts. Again, I am looking forward to having more. Xerneas used to be my favorite legendary until the introduction of Terapagos. So I have always loved these Pokemon. Again, Kalos is my favorite region, but I just don't have a ton to say. And I feel bad saying that. I haven't marinated maybe on this enough to really give insight. But if people have thoughts, I'm curious to hear them, because I love interacting with folks and kind of like building our understanding together. That's my favorite thing. Hopefully you found this unnecessarily exhaustive deep dive interesting. Maybe it'll give you some insight and thoughts as to what you expect to see in PLZA. Of course, we don't know anything, and I don't want to claim that I know. This is just some kind of scientific assessment, some kind of historic perspective to look at these and see if we're able to get a glimpse of what might be going on and what we could expect. I do also hope that you're excited for this game. Obviously, I'm a lover of Pokemon. You can barely see my Sylveon hoodie and my Pokemon in the background. If you like what you'd see, I'd love for you to consider subscribing. I'm working on getting more Pokemon content as Legends is ramping up. There's going to be more content here talking about it, as well as on my other platforms. So hopefully you'll consider checking out some of my other stuff in the future. Thanks for watching today. Here's a video that you might actually like as well, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.